They laughed at the old Navy man when he started drilling holes along the frozen lake shore and stringing ropes between the pines, until the ice cracked open one February morning, and every family in Coldwater Bend learned exactly what those ropes were for. Gideon Marsh had come to Pelham Lake the way most men his age came to quiet places. Quietly, he drove up from Duluth in a truck that needed new shocks and a dog that needed nothing at all, because Rook had always known exactly what he was doing, even when the rest of the world didn't. The cabin had belonged to Gideon's older brother, who'd passed in September without any children to leave it to, so it went to Gideon. 64 years old, retired Navy, 2 bad knees and a left ear that caught maybe 70% of what people said to him. He'd take it. He'd take the cabin and the lake and the long silences and the particular cold that settled over northern Minnesota in November, like a second sky pressing down on the first one. Rook jumped out of the truck before the engine was fully off. The dog stood at the edge of the gravel path, nose up, reading whatever the lake was saying that morning. He was a shepherd mix, black and tan, with one slightly bent ear that had never quite straightened since the day he was born. He'd been with Gideon for 6 years. Before that, he'd been a working dog in the Navy's canine unit, assigned to Gideon for the last 2 years of Gideon's service. When Gideon retired, he'd made one request, just the one. They'd let him keep Rook. The nearest neighbor was a man named Dale Pruitt, who ran a bait shop on the south end of the lake and plowed driveways in winter for extra money. He was friendly enough the first time he came around, shook Gideon's hand, mentioned something about a casserole his wife was going to send over. But Dale had a way of talking where the friendliness sat right on top of a layer of wariness, the way a thin crust of ice sits over deep water. You could see through it if you knew where to look. Gideon noticed it, but didn't mind. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there because Pelham Lake was the first place in 20 years that had felt, from the moment he stepped out of his truck, like somewhere he was supposed to be. He spent the first 2 weeks settling in, cleared the dead branches off the porch, replaced the cracked window in the back bedroom, stacked what firewood the shed held, and made a note that he'd need more, a lot more, before January. He walked the lakeshore every morning with Rook, learning the shape of the land the way he used to learn the layout of a new post. Methodically, quietly, storing each detail somewhere reliable in the back of his mind. That was when he started to notice things about the lake. Pelham Lake was not a safe body of water. He'd grown up around enough frozen lakes to understand that they all had their own temperament, their own weak spots, their own way of failing. Pelham was spring-fed, which meant the temperature of the water moving underneath varied in ways that the surface didn't show. There were 3 places along the north shore where the ice formed later and thinned earlier, but from a distance, from the road where the ice fishermen parked their trucks and dragged their gear, you couldn't tell them from the rest. They looked solid. They looked fine. They were neither. He walked those sections with Rook every few days through November, pressing a steel rod into the surface every 20 feet, measuring. The dog had been trained to detect dangerous ice by sound. The difference in the way pressure traveled through a hollow sheet versus a solid one. And on 2 of those 3 sections, Rook would stop dead and look back at Gideon with an expression that didn't need translation. Not here. Don't go here. In early December, Gideon drove to the hardware store in town, Milford's, and bought 200 feet of heavy-gauge rope, a box of steel eyelet anchors, a bag of concrete mix, and several long wooden stakes. The man at the register, whose name tag said Owen, looked at the pile and asked if he was building a dock extension. "Safety markers," Gideon said, "along the north shore." Owen blinked. "There's not much over there. That's all private land." "My land," Gideon said. Owen shrugged and rang it up. He started the next morning, drove the stakes at 8-foot intervals along the tree line above the weak sections, sunk the concrete anchors deep, strung the rope in a continuous line with orange flagging every 10 feet. Then he extended it, running a second line 15 yards back from the shore, A parallel guide rope that someone could grab and follow even in low visibility, even if they couldn't see where the land was. The ropes were low, knee-height, the way a trail guide marks the edge of a cliff. Nothing dramatic, nothing complicated. Just a system. Rook inspected each anchor as Gideon sunk it, walking the line carefully, touching each post with his nose, approving or finding something that needed adjustment. They worked well together still, the way they always had, communicating in a shorthand that had developed over years of needing to understand each other without a lot of words. Dale Pruitt came by on the third day. He pulled his truck to the edge of the road and leaned out the window, squinting at the ropes along the tree line. "What are you putting up, Marsh?" "Safety line. Ice is weak along that north stretch." Dale's expression shifted into something politely skeptical. "That ice has been fine for 15 years. Guys fish that section every winter. 3 sections where the feed springs run close to the surface," Gideon said. "Ice there is 2 inches thinner than everywhere else. In a bad year, it won't hold." Dale looked at the rope as if it had personally offended him. "You're going to spook people. They'll think the whole lake is off limits." "I'll put up signs," Gideon said. "Just for the 3 sections. I've been on that lake my whole life," Dale said. "I know where the weak spots are." Gideon said nothing. He turned back to the anchor he'd been setting and drove the post deeper into the frozen ground. After a moment, Dale's truck rolled on. By the following weekend, everyone in Coldwater Bend seemed to know about the old Navy man and his ropes. Gideon heard about it secondhand, through the kid who delivered propane, who mentioned with a careful kind of casualness that folks were asking questions. He heard it in the hardware store, where 2 men he didn't know went quiet when he walked in. He saw it in the way people looked at the orange flagging along his shoreline when they drove past. Slow, window down. The way people look at something they're not sure whether to be amused by or concerned about. He didn't mind the looking. He'd been looked at before. One night, he sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the maps he'd made of the lake bed, the ones he'd put together by drilling test holes in November and feeding a weighted line down until it touched bottom. He'd cross-referenced those depths with the water temperature readings he'd been taking every 4 days. Rook lay under the table with his chin on Gideon's boot, warm and still. Gideon looked at the maps for a long time. The data was clear. This winter was running colder than average. The warm spell that usually came through in January and softened things, the one Dale and everyone else was counting on, the one that had made the lake feel predictable for years, it might not come. And if it didn't, and if the fishing clubs brought their ice shanties out to the same locations they used every year, and if the temperature swung back up fast after a cold snap the way it sometimes did. He put down the mug. Rook lifted his head slightly, reading the silence. "I know," Gideon said quietly. "I know." He went outside and added 2 more anchor points he'd been planning for later. The first week of January arrived with temperatures the Weather Service called unseasonably low, and the old-timers called a sign. The lake froze hard, harder than anyone had seen in years. 7 inches in the safe sections, which was fine for snowmobiles, fine for the ice fishing shanties that started appearing on the South Basin on the second weekend. No one went to the North Shore. The ropes were still there. Dale Pruitt drove by once and waved without stoppings. Small progress. Then, on the 3rd Saturday of January, Gideon woke at 4 in the morning because Rook was already awake. The dog stood at the back door, not barking, not whining, just standing with the particular stillness he used when something was wrong, but not yet close. The kind of stillness that said, "Listen." Gideon dressed and went outside. The temperature had climbed 30 degrees overnight. He could feel it immediately. That wrong-season softness in the air, the drip of melt water off the porch rail. He walked to the lake's edge and pressed the steel rod into the ice near the shore. 4.5 inches. It had been 7 the day before. He went back inside, called the county emergency line, told them about the temperature swing and the shanties on the South Basin. The woman on the line was polite. She said she'd pass the information along. She said the ice fishing groups generally knew what they were doing. He called back an hour later and asked if anyone had gone to check. She put him on hold for 4 minutes, then came back and said the county road department had no vehicles available until morning. Gideon looked at Rook. Rook looked at Gideon. He loaded the truck. He drove to the South Basin access road and walked out onto the ice with a flashlight and his testing rod, and Rook moving ahead of him, silent and deliberate, stopping every 30 feet to listen to the ice beneath his paws. 3 of the 6 shanties were occupied. Gideon knocked on the first one. A heavy-set man in his 50s named Lou Garner opened the door and looked at Gideon with the expression of someone who had just been woken up mid-fish. "Ice is pulling back fast," Gideon said. "Overnight melt. You need to get your gear and go now." Lou looked past him at the dark lake, then back at Gideon. "Who are you, neighbor?" "Gideon Marsh. I've been testing this ice since November." Lou looked down at the rod in Gideon's hand. He looked at Rook. Rook stood slightly behind Gideon's left knee, body quiet, eyes on Lou. "I've fished this lake for 12 years, Lou said. "And this winter has been different from the last 12, Gideon said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to pull a test hole and see for yourself." Something in the way he said it, flat, without alarm, the way men who've been in actual danger tend to speak, made Lou reach for his auger. The test hole showed 3 inches in the center of the South Basin. Lou Garner had 3 inches of ice between himself and 20 feet of water. By the time the sun came up, all 6 shanties had been pulled to shore. Lou's truck slid on the access road in the soft snow and needed a push, and Gideon and Rook helped him with that too. No one said much. But 2 days later, when the ice on the South Basin cracked across its full width in a sound like a rifle shot at 2 in the afternoon, Lou Garner had been in his living room with a cup of coffee. He called Gideon that evening and didn't have a lot of words, but the ones he had were enough. The real trouble came in February. There was a week of hard cold back below 0, which thickened the ice again. Then another rapid warm-up, this one faster and less predictable than anything the extended forecast had called for. The ice on the main basin went from 9 inches to 4.5 in 72 hours. The North Shore sections, where the springs ran close to the surface, were down to less than 2. The weekend it happened was a 3-day holiday weekend. The lake was crowded. Families with young children had walked out to watch a friend's ice fishing tournament. 2 snowmobiles were doing wide loops across the South Basin. A group of teenagers from the high school had set up a small bonfire on the ice near the public access, a thing people did there in winter. Normal, familiar, safe, the way it had always been. Rook heard it before Gideon did. The dog had been lying near the wood stove when he stood up fast, walked to the window, and let out 2 sharp barks. Not his alert bark, not his people bark, but the one he used for ice. The one Gideon had heard only twice before, short and hard, and carrying something in the pitch of it that made your stomach drop. Gideon was at the door in less than 30 seconds. He heard it then, a sound that carried across the lake and through the trees, like a long, slow exhale from deep underground. Then shouting, multiple voices, he ran. Rook hit the lakeshore ahead of him, already pulling toward the sound. Gideon followed the dog across the open ice, testing each section with his weight before committing, years of training overriding the urge to just run. The shouting grew. He could see figures on the North Basin, some standing, some not. A section of ice the size of a tennis court had given way near the first spring vent. 2 people were in the water. 3 more were on the ice nearby, trying to reach them without getting close enough to go in themselves. One of them was a child, maybe 8 years old, standing rigid with shock on a section that Gideon could see flexing under her weight. He reached the guide rope he'd strung in December and used it to work around the perimeter of the open section, moving fast but not carelessly. Rook tracked beside him, knowing without instruction to stay off the flexing area. He found a long pine branch near the tree line, dragged it back, called out to the 2 people in the water, a man and a teenage girl, father and daughter. He'd learn later, the Fenner family, from 2 miles down the county road, told them to grab the branch and not to try to climb, just to hold on and kick. He pulled them out one at a time, his arms burned. His boots were soaked through from kneeling on the wet ice. Rook pressed his body against the man's side the moment he was clear of the water. Because a wet body losing heat on a cold surface needed warmth, and the dog understood this without being told. The little girl on the flexing section was Dale Pruitt's granddaughter. He'd find that out later, too. He got to her by testing the ice every 2 steps, moving in a wide arc away from the failed section, talking to her the whole time in the low, steady voice he'd used in the Navy when everything was going wrong, and the only tool anyone had left was the sound of someone who wasn't panicking. "You're doing good? Don't move. I'm coming." She looked at him with eyes so wide they seemed to be taking up most of her face. Rook appeared at Gideon's side, and the moment the dog came into the little girl's line of sight, something in her expression changed. The dog was there. Dogs were safe. She held still. Gideon reached her. He wrapped her in his jacket and carried her off the ice the long way around, testing every step, Rook just behind him. By the time they reached the shore, someone had called 911. Someone else had a car running with the heat on. A woman was crying into a phone. 2 men Gideon had never met were asking him what to do, and he told them, and they did it, and no one questioned a word he said. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later. Both the man and the teenage girl who'd gone through were treated for hypothermia and released. No one died. On a weekend like that, on ice like that, with families spread across the surface from shore to shore, it could have been so much worse. Gideon walked home in wet boots and didn't say much to anyone. That evening, Dale Pruitt knocked on his door. Dale looked older than the last time Gideon had seen him, which had only been 2 weeks ago. He held his hat in his hands and he didn't have a prepared speech. He just stood in the doorway and said his granddaughter's name, and then he had to stop and look at the floor of the porch for a while. Gideon waited. "Those ropes," Dale finally said. "I saw you use them. The way you went around the edge of the section." He cleared his throat. "If you hadn't put those ropes in back in December, you'd have found another way," Gideon said. Dale shook his head. "I wouldn't have. I'd have gone straight across. I'd have lost my footing on the wet ice and I'd have gone in and she'd have been there alone." Rook appeared at Gideon's knee and looked up at Dale without hostility, just the steady, assessing look he gave people he was deciding whether to trust. Dale reached down slowly and put his hand on the dog's head. Rook let him. "I said some things," Dale said, "around town. About you being paranoid. About the ropes being. I said it was ridiculous, that it would scare away business at the lake." Gideon didn't say anything. "I was wrong," Dale said, and then, very quietly, "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, the cold coming off the lake in long, slow waves. Rook sat between them, looking at neither one, watching the tree line. The County Emergency Management Office called the following Tuesday. A woman named Peterson, who had a careful, official voice, told Gideon they'd like to have someone come out and see what he'd built along the North Shore. They'd received several calls. They wanted to understand the system. He walked the property with 2 men from the county and 1 from the state DNR. He showed them the anchor points, the rope lines, the drainage channels he'd added in November to redirect meltwater away from the spring sections. He showed them his depth charts, the temperature logs, the hand-drawn maps of the lake bed he'd made with his test rod over the course of 2 months. The DNR man was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you do all of this by yourself?" "Rook helped," Gideon said. The man looked at the dog. "He detects hollow ice by sound," Gideon said. "Different resonance than solid ice. I mapped the spring feed sections by following where he stopped." There was a county meeting the first week of March. The library meeting room, folding chairs, bad coffee in a paper cup. Gideon sat in the front row with Rook at his feet, and the room behind him was full. Dale Pruitt spoke first, which surprised Gideon. Dale talked about the ropes and what he'd seen on the day the ice failed, and he didn't use words like prepared or lucky. He used the word careful, which was closer to right. Lou Garner talked about the January night and the 3 inches of ice. The Fenner family, the man and his daughter who'd gone through, sat in the third row. The daughter was 17, a girl named Ivy, with a braid over one shoulder and the look of someone who had recently learned something important about the world and was still deciding what to do with it. When the sheriff opened the floor for questions, she raised her hand and asked Gideon one thing. "How did you know? In November? How did you know it was going to be a bad year?" Gideon turned to look at her. Rook lifted his head. "I didn't know," Gideon said. "I prepared because I couldn't afford to be wrong." The room was quiet. He told them about the winter overseas, the one he usually didn't talk about. A night on a frozen river in a country he didn't name, where 3 men in his unit had gone through bad ice that no one had tested because the maps said it was safe. He'd pulled 2 of them out. He'd been close enough to reach the third, and he hadn't. He told them about the ice he'd tested in November when he first arrived at the lake, about walking those North Shore sections with Rook and feeling the way the snow sat wrong on the surface. Too dry, too thin. The way it sat over ice that wasn't as thick as it looked. He told them he'd been a Navy man for 31 years, and that in all that time, the only thing that had ever reliably kept people alive was someone noticing what was coming before it arrived. He looked at his dog when he said it. Rook looked back at him. "I'll walk the ice with anyone who wants to learn," Gideon said. "Before next winter, I'll show you what I know. It's not complicated. It just takes time, and you have to be willing to pay attention." He didn't say anything dramatic after that. He just picked up his coffee cup and waited. By April, there were 11 new safety rope lines installed along Pelham Lake. Dale Pruitt had put in 2 of them himself, on sections of his own shoreline that he'd realized after walking with Gideon had never been safe. Lou Garner organized a group from the fishing club that cleared brush from the access paths so emergency vehicles could reach the shore on any side of the lake. Ivy Fenner, the girl who'd gone through the ice in February, started coming out to the cabin on Saturday mornings. She was studying environmental science in high school and wanted to learn the depth mapping technique. She took careful notes. She was meticulous about the test rod, about the increments, about writing down not just the numbers, but the conditions, the air temperature, the wind direction, the time of day. Gideon taught her what he knew and didn't oversimplify it. Rook liked her from the first Saturday. The dog would walk beside her during the measurements, stopping when she stopped, waiting while she wrote. She learned quickly what his signals meant, the way his tail changed when the ice wasn't right, the way he'd angle his body slightly away from a section he didn't trust. One Saturday in late April, when the ice was long gone and the lake had opened into cold, dark, moving water again, they sat on the dock with mugs of tea, while Rook stretched in a patch of sun near the shore. "He's the one who knew first," Gideon said. "Every time." Ivy looked at the dog. What was it like, having a partner like that? Gideon considered the question. "Honest," he said. "He's always honest. There's no version of Rook that tells you the ice is fine when it isn't." She nodded slowly. "That's a good thing to have. Best thing," Gideon agreed. The county put up a marker at the public lake access in May. Plain wood, nothing flashy. It said something about ice safety and testing protocols and listed a phone number for the emergency management offices. At the bottom, someone at the county had added a line about the safety lines on the North Shore and credited the system to a local resident. Dale told Gideon about it when they ran into each other at Milford's hardware store. Gideon drove out to see it and stood there for a minute, reading it, with Rook next to him. He thought about the men he hadn't been able to bring back to the surface 20-some years ago on that frozen river. He thought about the way ice looked fine until the exact moment it wasn't. He thought about the drive up from Duluth in a truck with bad shocks, and about his brother's cabin, and about the thing that had felt, from the first morning, like he was supposed to be there. He put his hand on Rook's back. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." The dog walked beside him to the truck, steady and unhurried, and the lake behind them caught the late afternoon light and held it. still and flat and quiet, the way a thing does when it has nothing left to hide.